As a disclaimer, of course, just to remind everyone, we now have an open Discord for everyone to join. Link right down in the description. And as I have been told recently, we didn't even have an easy and available link to click for my stream, now live in the EU evenings, so you get that as well down below in the description. Now, for today, we are approaching the end of the second week of Season 3, and what is relevant for today is to check the situations, the meta, the data, the rankings and statistics of the raid. You know why? Because, spoilers, I guess, to those who were, I don't know, keeping this for later, the race to World First is over. Echo won the race and Liquid came second, so suck it NA, this tier around, EU wins. What is relevant about the race being over is that now that you don't have to wait for the first guild to clear the Mythic raid, Blizzard is now free. Blizzard can now put on some balance tuning, some buffs, some nerfs to certain specs based on their performance in the raid. So we want to take a snapshot after the first couple of weeks of the results and the performance of the specs in the raid, so that we can then perhaps check in a few days by the next reset, when Blizzard will very likely push forward some changes, some balancing to the specs, to some of the specs. Going to take a look at the results of the specs in Mythic raiding. We have a few sources we can use to check the results. So let's start with u.gg. This site is looking the damage and then of course the healing scores as well, based on Mythic progression, as well as the logs available from Mythic, and these are the initial results after roughly a couple of weeks of results in Mythic. Obviously we are missing quite a lot of bosses still to show up in the progression, in the numbers, like basically the later bosses, so these numbers are still preliminary. What we see at the top are three specs that we have seen before, with one rising a tiny bit more, which is Demonology Warlock. Beast Mastery was already a known pick, so was Havoc Demon Hunter, and even Assassination Rogue has actually spiked up even more than previously expected. We can see the average number of assassination being quite high, especially compared to everyone else considered an A tier spec in the raid. We have also seen over time that assassination has become more and more chosen over Outlaw. You know, the power of Outlaw at the moment is more in Mythic Plus over their power in the raid. Even if you look at the popularity, Outlaw is almost 4 times less popular than Assassination is, for example. Not just the performance right now of Assassination, but of course also their popularity is beating Outlaw. The position of Demo, even though perhaps it might be surprising for them to be so high, is definitely not surprising that they are so much higher than the other two Warlock specs. We kind of knew about this already. We knew that even though we have an almost 9% of all picks for DPS in the raid being Demo, it's not surprising that not even 1% of the choices are the other two Warlock specs, by not being essentially very strong. Other ranking sites like Subcreation, for example, put other specs in slightly different positions. For example, while you still have Havoc as well as BM and even Demonology quite high, you have Balance, for example. For the range DPS you have Balance, and for the melee you have a congregation of other specs, all considered very, very powerful. Enhancement, Assassination, Fury and Unholy are all doing quite well right now, according to those numbers. Same goes for Balance. What is not surprising, or maybe it is that after the 57th nerf, Augmentation Evoker now is no longer considered a must at all times pick in the raid. We have started to see this slightly more in Mythic Plus as well, and now it is even more relevant, it is even more prevalent in the raid. You still see players going the way of augmentation. You still see how players were convinced that at the beginning of this tier you would have needed 1, 2, 3, perhaps 4 augmentation evokers in the raid. So the result is that augmentation is still the second most popular spec in the raid, even though now their performance is not nearly as powerful as before. Yes, they still bring some defensive powers to the raid, but nowhere near as strong as what they used to bring in a party in Mythic Plus before. That has been nerfed as well. So we definitely don't have this S tier status of augmentation anymore in this patch after the several rounds of nerfs they have received. You can also look at the actual numbers, the actual stats from the raid itself from Warcraft logs. You can gauge some of these results and putting them back into a ranking to kind of make sense, because if you look at the top performers, you see Assassination, Havoc, BM, Outlaw, Demo, as well as Enhancement. So specs we have seen here already, right? We have seen all of these specs, Havoc, Enhancement, Assassination, BM, Demo, Balance mentioned already. What is slightly different between what people put in a ranking and what the actual numbers are, for example, is Marksmanship being very high up, and then you have Elemental being very high up, and then of course you also have Subtlety and you have Survival. When you go back and look at the rankings, for example, here is Sub, here is Survival, here is Marksmanship, for example. We can switch to a different type of ranking. Here is Marksmanship, here is Sub, and here is Survival, and here is Elemental. So we have rankings putting these specs quite low down, quite weak, but then we have the actual numbers telling us these specs are actually doing top half results. You know, why is something like, you know, one of the mages considered quite powerful? Why is Unholy considered powerful? And why even is Augmentation considered powerful in these rankings, in these tier lists? Why are they all in the upper tier of results if they are all losing to Marksmanship? Marksmanship is considered like a trash mob of a Mythic Plus 6 key. Why are they so low down in these tier lists if their performance is so high? You can even see their damage, how different it looks like when you have a bottom tier of DPS saying, yeah, 165k is very much lower than 211. Yeah, 190, 176, yeah, these are all low number, and then you move to Marksmanship and you see 233, which technically is the highest DPS out of any other right here, right? So that's weird, that's confusing. Well, the answer, of course, is what we talked about at the start. The answer that if you look at the small demon logs, for example, you have a grand total of, what, 2 guilds, 3 guilds being logged on this boss. So the number of logs that will make the rankings right now on Warcraft logs are on the most popular bosses with the most logs, which usually means the early ones. In the early ones, you see Marksmanship doing very well, for example. We can also add Outlaw, Subtlety, Survival, some of the specs we mentioned already. You can then move to Igira, which is another early boss, and you can also see Marksmanship doing quite well right there. You can also then move to Volcaros, which is a single target boss again, and Marksmanship is still in the top half, right? So just based on the early bosses, now you have Council of Dreams, Marksmanship is 3rd, and that's just about how long Marksmanship exists for. If you move over to Larodar, there is no Marksmanship Hunter anymore. Same goes when you move over to Nimue, where you do see Marksmanship, but only as a tiny little dot, because the amount of Marksmanship hunters on Nimue are 1, right? So the numbers might look like they are great for Marksmanship, but it doesn't make much of any sense given that they are still very underplayed, very unpopular, especially the higher you go in bosses. We can look here at the popularity and you can see Marksmanship. There is a grand total of 80 of them. 80 compared to the 7,784 Beast Mastery Hunters. So 1%. 1% of all the ranged hunters are Marksmanship right now, so their results here are much less reliable. And this is the same argument you can make for a few of the other specs we mentioned being lower down, even though their performance seems higher. We mentioned specs like Subtlety, we mentioned even specs like Survival, specs like Elemental. that is why it is more misleading to see these specs higher up if you just look at the actual results and getting the help of some of these ranking sites which put together both the performance with the popularity, the number of logs available for these specs, can put in better perspective why certain specs, even though their damage is looking high in the overall results, they are not nearly as much of a meta spec overall compared to their performance, which looked much better. This is obviously, as we said, just partially the results of the raid, as we still miss quite a few more bosses to go through. We can still, though, look at the results that we have, for example, for healers. This is another thing that might have a similar mentality, because when you look at the results of the healers at the moment, the number 2 healer supposedly is Restoration Shaman. When you look at the popularity of the results, Restoration Shaman is down last compared to all other healers. Right now is Discipline Priest, with quite a gap from Holy, and then Mistweaver, Restoration Druid, Preservation Evoker, Holy Priest, and later down Resto Shaman. So similar to the DPS, if you move to the healers, again you can see that even with the technically numbers-wise Resto Shaman being far and away the best, it's still not really being considered nearly as much. Also, we can say that if the DPS results might be misleading in a way, what could be even more misleading, of course, are the HPS results, which in many cases mean even less than the DPS results in the raid especially. This is of course quite similar to this, where you have Mistweaver Monk quite far ahead everyone else, and then you have these 3 specs, Shaman, Priest, Preservation Evoker, somewhat close to each other, right? In numbers, it's relevant, it's similar, but of course it doesn't reflect the actual power level of the specs, or at the very least what guild members, what guilds think power level of the specs is, based on how many of these players are actually playing each spec. Perhaps it might be Restoration Shaman was underappreciated, underrated maybe before the release of the season. That could definitely be a thing, but once more, HPS is not everything when it comes to raiding, especially mythic raiding. One of the very important things, for example, would be to be able to split, to be able to assign cooldowns, powerful cooldowns of healers for different situations. And for example, the weakest cooldowns in the game to place around are the ones of a Mistweaver Monk, who just works on constant 1-minute windows. Even their major cooldown revival is terrible. In fact, you only want it when you can master spell things away from people, like the magical debuffs on Sarkaret, the magical debuffs on Tindral, or the magical debuffs on Farak. That's even more valuable than the actual heal. You would much rather want to be able to place around a fight things like Barrier, things like Evangelism and Rapture, things like Spirit Link, things like Tranquility, Rewind, etc, etc. More so than what, for example, a Mistweaver has. So it's not just HPS that is the value for healers, even more so than DPS is the value for a DPS spec. This one though being the first couple of weeks of mythic progression, we can look at something cooler, which is the deaths. Something I'm always a big fan of, to check just how much specs are dying. We can check all the kills and all the wipes first, so just including everything that has been going on, that has been tracked on Warcraft logs. We can find, with an interesting surprise, I wouldn't have said that Balanced Druid and Feral Druid are the deathiest of all the specs. Balance is reasonable given that after a few nerfs to their defensiveness, and given that most of the damage now in this raid is gonna be magical damage, so the Moonkin form and the extra armor given to a Balanced Druid are kind of useless in this raid, so it does make somewhat more sense. Feral though, Feral is tankier than Balance, so it's still surprising to see them be the number 1 in deaths when it comes to melee DPS, for example. When it comes to healers, it's less surprising. When you look at this list of deathness, you have quite low down Resto Shaman, you also have quite low down Mistweaver, as well as Resto Druid and Holy Priest. Holy Paladin starts going a bit higher up, and then there is a massive spike for Discipline Priest, which is far and away the deathiest out of all of the healers, at 23% of the pools having a Discipline Priest die. It's almost twice as much as the amount of Resto Shamans actually dying in a pool, for example. Other specs that might be surprising in how much they have died could be the difference, the significant difference between Fury and Arms. There is almost a 50% difference in how more often Arms Warriors die than Fury. Another one could be the difference between Frost and Fire Mage, although Fire Mages do have a cheat death, so it's kind of easier for them to stay alive. You also have Unholy being more often alive than Frost DK in the same class. Another one of the differences in picks. Obviously, when looking at tanks, it's less relevant to see how much they die. It's not often their fault entirely, but we do see we have 4 specs all easily chilling at the bottom, like you would expect for a tank in a raid to be the one that dies the least. And then you have Guardian. Guardian, who dies twice as much than every other tank spec, barring Protection, which is still dying more than the bottom 4 of the tank specs. Some of these numbers are not very surprising, of course. You're not surprised to see the 3 Warlock specs being the tankiest. That's not major news. Red Paladin also being quite tanky, Augmentation being quite tanky. Those are, not very surprising choices. These were the numbers of deaths of specs, as you can see here, from all kills and all wipes. These are the most dying specs right now in these first couple of weeks of Mythic progression. Now that we have a decent outlook on number 1, who ins the most every pull, what are the results of the specs so far in this first couple of weeks, both from a DPS perspective but also an HPS and healing perspective. This is what we can take a picture of before this incoming reset, and very likely before the end of the next reset, to see what will the incoming balance doing changes be, because that is what we are now expecting. With the race to world first being over, that is likely what Blizzard will be working on when it comes to balancing of the meta, so to speak, in the raid. With this out of the way, I'm going to leave you to your own conclusions about this, this picture. What would you like to see higher up in these lists, and what would you like to see brought a little bit further down in these lists? Of course, I'm sure you will leave any of your personal biases aside and won't just ask to have your main spec buffed if it's too weak, or not ask to have your OP spec nerfed if it's too strong. I'm sure you are people of integrity and will not do that. So, besides this, on this Monday, I'm going to leave you to the rest of whatever you were doing. I actually don't care for today. Let's thank, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, together with everyone who can also support completely for free, by liking and commenting, for example, down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, I guess, and in the meantime... it's okay. It's okay. It's all good. All good.